Welcome back to the conference, or welcome to the conference if you're joining us for the first time today. This is the 2021 annual conference held for the first time in virtual format. This is our 45th annual conference. Many of you will know that WFO celebrated its 50th anniversary a year or so ago, but there were apparently some years that didn't have a conference. So this is our 45th conference, and we're happy to have you here. I wanted to acknowledge Jen Hodge, who has been our logistics guru and set up the conference for us. She's here either in the background or sometimes front and center, helping with technical issues and helping attendees with any problems that they might have. So I want to thank her profusely. I wanted to mention that when you have questions for speakers, to use the Q&A function. Questions tend to get a little bit lost in the chat area because people are asking other questions about how things are working and so on and so forth. I wanted to make a couple of announcements about the schedule today before introducing our first speaker. First of all, at the 3:30 afternoon session, we'll be holding our annual members meeting, at which we elect new board members, present the continuing board members and officers to the membership, and make other additional announcements. There will be a brief presentation about the birdathon, so I hope as many of you can come to that as possible. Also, if you attended Bryce Robinson's presentation on flickers yesterday at the afternoon science session, you remember that we had a fairly serious technical issue at that time, and so that talk has been rescheduled for tomorrow, Sunday, in the 3:30 p.m. science session. So I wanted you to know that that talk was going to be available. See, I think that's it for announcements. It's my pleasure to introduce John Dunn and Alex Cho for our morning presentation. John is well known to birders as author of the 7th edition of the National Geographic Field Guide to Birds of North America. And as most of you know, he was either the chief consultant or co-author for the previous 6 editions. He's well known to WFO members, having been a board member for over 20 years and currently serving as our president. In addition, he's been on the California Bird Records Committee for over 30 years and is currently serving on the Committee for Classification and Nomenclature of the American Ornithological Society. He has too many publications to mention. His co-presenter today is Alex Cho, who is a young birder from Southern California, currently residing in the Bay Area. Alex began birding at the age of 8 in his backyard and quickly expanded his interests, and has become involved in a number of community science projects, including the Bluebird Recovery Program, Heron and Egret Nest Project, and other projects. He's an avid photographer, especially of birds, but also of other subjects, and is a member of the North American Nature Photographers Association. In 2016, he received an award as a Condor Ambassador from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Today, John and Alex are going to be speaking to us on the Tule Goose, a distinct species. John and Alex, take it away.
Good morning, all. Thank you for tuning in, not going birding, or probably many of you maybe did go birding, and that's just great. Some of us are birding from our window, kind of a unique approach. Each of us, both Alex and myself, have our own journey with the Tule Goose. For me, it was seeing an article by Bruce Krogman in American Birds in 1978, journal that's now North American Birds. And I looked at this big dark goose and didn't realize I had never seen one, and was fascinated that it basically, this mysterious big dark goose, the Tule Goose, that they still were unsure about it. The breeding grounds had not been documented, and I knew I'd never seen one, and I would not see one for another 20 years. I believe I finally saw them in 2000. Alex, and by the way, you'll please attend Alex and Aaron's talk on bird photography later today. had his own journey, but which he'll describe. But we worked on this program together. Alex tracked down a lot of the literature, and we looked at them together in the field. And so this is a fully collaborative effort. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alex.
I'll share my screen. Thanks, John. Welcome, everybody. I'm Alex, and as John said, today we will be talking about the Tule Goose. Thank you for attending.
So here's a teaser photo. You can see it's with very blackish head and neck, blackish brown, and that's probably the primary field mark, just as an introduction. Next image. So we quote Bob Elgis talking about it as a bird of mystery. In 1972, the taxon is named after him for all of his work on the subject. We just point out there's been a lot of publicity about other species that nests were elusive to find, like the black swift, understandable under roaring waterfalls, not till 1901, or the famous expedition to find the bristle-thighed curlew nest in Southwest Alaska in 1948, detailed in the pages of National Geographic. But the Tule Goose, elgasi, outlasted all of those, and it wasn't until 1979 where the nesting grounds were discovered on Cook Inlet by Bob Elgis after a tip in '78. We began to reveal clarity to the taxonomy and just how confined this subspecies was. Next image.
And so with the greater white-fronted goose, first, let's start with the family, which is the family of Anatidae. Anatidae has 5 subfamilies and 49 genera. The subfamily of Anserinae, which is the swans and typical geese, has 6 extant genera and 24 species. These genera include, in AOS sequence, the genus of Anser, which is the gray and white geese, the genus of Branta, which is the partly black geese, the genus of Cygnus, which is the true swans, and we'll also mention here of the subfamily also includes Cereropsis from Australia and Coscaroba from South America and the Falkland Islands. There is also Snemiornis, which is the prehistoric New Zealand goose. Going further into the genus of Anser, Anser now contains 11 species, which is the bar-headed goose, the emperor goose, the Ross's goose, the snow goose, the gray-leg goose, the swan goose, the taiga bean goose, the pink-footed goose, the tundra bean goose, the greater white-fronted goose, and the lesser white-fronted goose. You can see here there is a phylogenetic tree detailing all of the geese. And notice on the linear sequence that pink-footed goose is between tundra and taiga bean geese. This is interesting as many, or possibly even most places, lump the bean geese as a single species, which can affect the linear sequencing. It's also good to note that emperor goose, Ross's goose, and snow goose were formerly in a different genus, genus Ken, but were now moved to the genus Anser.
So a few more things about the greater white-fronted goose. The English name and the specific epithet, albifrons, or white-fronted goose, of course, refer to the white feathering at the base of the bill, which is an adult-like feature, which is not acquired till about a year of life. And this is important in identification as aging birds correctly. The hunter's name for them is often speckle belly or flock speckle bellies, referring to the black blotching underneath, which is variable among subspecies. Again, that's an adult-like feature that's not acquired till the second fall or at about 15 months of age. So remember again, the juveniles lack the white front or the black on the belly. They have a number of other important things to say, but let's move on to the taxonomy, the next image. The greater white-fronted goose is a whole Arctic species, basically, along with the Bryant. Each are polytypic with distinctive subspecies. The greater white-fronted goose is pretty scarce in eastern North America, so that's the one part of the world where they're largely absent. So there are 3 to 6 named subspecies, and the take-home message here is that 3 are distinct. And basically albifrons, the nominate, and sponsa are extremely similar, the birds of Southwest Alaska. Albifrons is Eurasia, sometimes East Asian. Birds that are larger, a bit larger, are called albicans. And gambeli is also larger, but there's very little coloration difference between them. And they could all perhaps be lumped as a single subspecies, albifrons. But the 2 distinctive ones are Flavirostris from Western Greenland, which winters in Ireland and Scotland. And it's a little darker with a more orange rather than pink bill. And the black on the belly of adults can become almost solidly black. And the one we're discussing today, elgasi, which Alex will detail the differences. Notice with elgasi, there's just a little pink spot there, a little in from the upper end of Cook Inlet. And they winter currently in Sacramento Valley, particularly 3 refuges. And that's the whole world range of this distinctive taxon. If it, of all of the goose taxa, it is the one that is the scarcest, with a population of several to fewer than 10,000. So take-home message, think of it as 3 subspecies: widespread albifrons, Flavirostris, Greenland, wintering in the UK, Ireland, and elgasi, although others are still currently recognized, but they're more size subspecies. Next image.
And so now let's focus on the Tule goose itself. This subspecies of the greater white-fronted goose is different enough in multiple aspects that it may in fact be a distinct species, and it has many differences to the other subspecies in addition to morphology. These differences include diet, habitat, and their isolated breeding range. They are the largest and darkest of the 5 subspecies, and they are monomorphic, with the sexes differing only in size, as with the other white-fronted goose subspecies. The males are larger than the females. And the sources differ in population estimates, but the most likely number of Tule goose is under 5,000, possibly under 3,000. This photo taken by Ed Harper shows 2 juvenile Tule geese. And now let's go into those differences. So this photo taken at Calusa National Wildlife Refuge shows a Tule goose with a much darker head and neck than the other subspecies, less barring on the belly, a somewhat thicker body, and a somewhat larger wingspan than the other subspecies. Their size differs from the other subspecies. They are much larger than sponsa, the Pacific subspecies, even somewhat larger than gambeli. They are darker than all the other named subspecies. And as I mentioned, they have fewer dark bars on the belly than the other subspecies. Their diet differs as well, with the Tule goose having a different diet than sponsa of gambeli, with much of it consisting of the tubers of Tule growth. Their calls and vocalizations are also coarser and harsher than the other subspecies, and possibly their internal structure is different as well. comments relayed from William Grenfell indicate that elgasi has a bigger gizzard, sometimes being up to 2 to 3 times larger than a sponsa's gizzard. However, this needs confirmation. Here's some more morphological differences to show. They have a dark head with some individuals having a dark cap. It's somewhat difficult to see, but you can see a little bit of it here. This photo was taken by Ed Harper. Here's an adult Tule Goose and an immature Tule Goose, and they have somewhat longer and thicker legs than the other subspecies. On the adults of the Tule geese, the amount of white and the pattern of white on the forehead appears to differ, but we haven't yet exactly figured out how it differs. And on top of that, many elgasi have a yellowish colored iron stain on the forehead, which likely reflects the habitat in which they feed. This photo shows that the elgasi have a long, dark neck, as previously mentioned, and some 40 to 50% of elgasi will have a yellow orbital ring. However, this is not a true diagnostic field mark. And elgasi's bill color starts whitish pink at the base, but becomes almost an intense carmine pink near the tip. And elgasi will often like to sit on dikes and levees out in the open.
So we call it the bird of mystery, and part of it's the rather mysterious, confusing, and muddled taxonomic history. One of the most important publications, and one that lays it out with clarity, as is often the case in Swarth's writing, is the publication by Swarth and Bryant in 1917, where they was the first significant detailing of these large, dark birds from the Butte Sink, the Sacramento Valley. And the important, perhaps the hero in our mind of this was 2 individuals, the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, I say that with pride, and a hunting guide. And they went out together on a poke boat in one of these wooded marshes. The guide, Samuel Lamb, would call these large dark geese correctly. Sometimes before they'd even see them, he'd hear them and say, those are the Tule or the timber geese. And he would point out all the field marks, the larger size, the different flight behavior, how they came in, smaller groups, tended to be quieter. Judge Henshaw shot them. He shot 16 specimens, and Lamb was right on every occasion. Lamb pointed out all the field marks, and these specimens were the basis for the paper by Swarth and Bryant, which electrified the ornithological community, at least in California. Keep in mind, they knew these birds were on the winter grounds. They had no idea where they went in the summer. James Moffett, became very interested in the subject and published in the 1920s. Moffett himself was caught up in World War II, and his plane crashed on Unalaska, the Dutch Harbor area, in 1943. His death, he's commemorated by John Aldrich, who named our common large Canada goose of the West, Moffatti, after him. And after World War II, we sort of went into the dark ages for several decades. Now, this sometimes happens. I just give the example of Robert Swinhoe, who named taxon of Kentish plover, then lumped with snowy plover, Diobatus, and in 1870, and then basically the taxon was largely forgotten, and now most splitted as a separate species, the white-faced plover, but that happened well more than a century later. Bob Elgas comes along the scene in 1960. He'd gotten captive Tule Goose, which he studied later with others in his game farm in Montana, and pursued the great mystery of finding out where these things bred. There had been some larger, darker birds from the Yukon, the Crow Flats. That area was investigated, but it wasn't until he got a tip in the fall of 1978 that they, in fact, nested a Cook Inlet, Redoubt Bay, and he went down and the next year in early July, the 3rd of July, and found family groups and definitively established the breeding range of the Tule Goose. A few years prior, Delacour and Ripley finally had established that this was indeed that they were not gamboli, that this came up with a new scientific name for the subspecies, honored elgas, so it's the name elgasi. But they described it as a distinct subspecies, still not knowing where the breeding grounds were. Since elgas, since Delacour and Ripley, a number of things have been published on this distinctive taxon. Most of them have Craig Ely's name attached to them. Other individuals are Wedge and John Takakawa. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing Wedge or Wedgie's name correctly. Please correct. And those studies have gone on, but they're large. Many of them are in waterfowl journals, and most haven't really followed the intricacies as they try to monitor and manage this taxon. Next slide. So let's do, Alex has detailed the differences, but here we have the two together. You might notice, just remember some of Alex's characters. The barring on the belly is sparser. Also, the background color, the neck, belly, everything's kind of uniform on sponsa and the other albifrons and gamboli, whereas on elgasi, the head and neck then lead to a much paler belly. So there's much more contrast. Though keep in mind, unless it's standing on a levee, that's a difference you won't notice because it'll be in the water. The barring is sparser on elgasi, fewer dark bars. And remember, this is a definitive adult. The bill shape is different. It looks a little longer and attenuated. And we're not sure this is valid, but the bill's a little more intensely carmine, especially in that rather broad subterminal tip area. The eye ring is an average feature. It's hard to see. The red collar, I'm not sure what the ringing scheme is these days, but that could potentially be a useful way to identify if you're keeping track if the Fish and Wildlife or Fish and Game posts their latest studies. This is a case where citizen science can help monitor where they are, but you got to make sure that it's the current scheme of the color scheme of these things, and they're large enough to read. Next image.
And here we have a comparison of the bills. This is a drawing from Swarth and Bryant's paper from 19th October 1917. This is a drawing of a Pacific white-fronted goose, and this is a drawing from a gamboli goose. But in 1917, the large and dark Sacramento Valley specimens were assigned the name gamboli or gamboli with 2 L's. But during that time, gamboli was actually elgasi, the Tule Goose. So you can see that the bill is quite thicker than the Pacific bill, but we have a slightly different opinion on the bill shape. We think that on elgasi, the bill gets thinner near the tip and possibly a little longer. And of course, over here is where we, as we mentioned, have the intense shade of pink. So you can see that the bill shape is different from the other subspecies of greater white-fronted goose. And next we will go over the vocalizations. The Tule goose has somewhat different vocalizations than the other subspecies, being coarser and harsher. More study is needed, however. It is difficult to get recordings of elgasi amongst hundreds, if not thousands of sponsa, and they often don't call until flushed, and even then their calls may get drawn out by the other sponsa calls. We have only found one recording of elgasi by Ed Pandolfino from 6 December 2018, taken at the Calusa National Wildlife Refuge in Calusa County. And I apologize, that was the sponsa call that was playing. I apologize for that, some technical difficulties. This is the elgasi call. Comparing that with the sponsa call, also taken by Ed Pandolfino on 15th October 2015 from Gray Lodge in Butte County. And ignore the great horned owl in the audio recording, but you can hear that the elgasi's calls seem to be coarser, harsher, and in groups of 3 rather than sponsas.
Oh, sorry. There's a difference in the habitats of these elgasi and the others. The elgasi prefers more wooded, swampy areas. Remember, one of the colloquial names is the timber goose, in addition to the Tule goose. So, for instance, at Calusa, they're in the more wooded marshes. Where they can be hard to see, but they will get up on levees and stand. The birds that go out to the grain fields are invariably sponsa. At that first pullout, everything I've ever seen there has been sponsa. That's not to say a Tule goose couldn't be there, but even in micro areas, the Tule geese prefer their own special areas. And of course, they breed around Cook Inlet and wooded swampy areas. The nests are some 75 meters, the few that have been found, away from any ponds, and they're totally isolated from the other, the sponsa geese or the gambeli in the Alaska and north of the Alaska range. White-fronted geese are solitary nesters, unlike the other Arctic nesting geese. In this case, they're more boreal nesting geese. The basic thing to most remember is carefully looking at flooded grain fields with thousands of white-fronted geese, with snows and rosses, maybe cackling geese, is not likely to be rewarding to finding a Tule goose. Next image.
So continuing on with that, now we will talk about their diet. The Tule goose's diet differs from that of the other subspecies in that it consists of the tubers of emergent growth, roots, rice, and corn, while they have been observed mainly feeding on the tubers of rice and rhizomes of alkali bulrush and Tule growth as pictured here. And the apparently much larger size of the gizzard of elgasi may be because of their different diet. However, as previously mentioned, more study and confirmation is needed for this fact.
So we've already, let's just summarize again. Here's a picture taken when finally the nesting grounds were proven. They're on Cook Inlet, Redoubt Bay. We'll say it before, but this was one of the main nesting areas, and the volcano Mount Redoubt in 1989, at least here, led to a reduction by 90% of the population of the effects, no doubt, the destruction of the habitat. But here's the documenting evidence. So very limited breeding areas confined, Redoubt Bay and Susitna Flats area, some 75 miles north. And again, repeat, well separated from other, both gambeli and sponsa populations of greater white-fronted geese. They hang out there at Cook Inlet, arrive in late April, and depart in late August. Interesting, Ely and others documented a molt migration to out towards the YK Delta region, the Noko National Wildlife Refuge, where they mixed with sponsa. These were molting birds, non-breeders. So, and then they came back to Cook Inlet, and then their migration, they leave by late August down to their winter grounds in California. Next image. So they have several staging areas, the Copper River Delta, and in Summer Lake in Lake County, Oregon, and Upper and Lower Klamath. And then the main wintering area, well, really these days, the only wintering area, the Sacramento Valley, the west side of the Sacramento Valley, perhaps a few in Sassoon marshes. Their status in British Columbia and Washington's a bit muddled. Probably like so many other areas, they're just not looked for carefully. This is one very well documented record of a bird we had in early December 2016 at Crowley Lake in southern Mono County, with 2 juvenile sponsa and 1 adult elgasi. Chris Howard spotted right away. We saw them on the water out in the middle of the lake, and then in flight, and said, well, this one's much larger. So I thought of gambeli, but later in the afternoon when the light was better, we noticed all of the morphological differences and made an effort to document it. There's some records reported from the Great Plains, which is possible if it got caught up with the wrong. Remember, the gambeli migrates primarily to the southern Great Plains, northeast Mexico, so maybe one got caught up and shot. This is the only record we know of for eastern California, and it was a fall migrant. Crowley Lake gets down to 20 below zero, so almost all, well, once it freezes, everything leaves. But we didn't hear this bird, but we were able to get good documenting photos. So the migration, to summarize, is targeted to a few specific sites, which brings to mind again the importance of conservation efforts to maintain those sites, in addition to the winter and the breeding grounds. Next image.
So now we'll talk about the wintering grounds. As we mentioned, the Tule Goose only winters in California at the Sacramento Valley, mainly found at the Sacramento, Delavan, and Calusa National Wildlife Refuges. Formerly, as we mentioned, they were also well known at Sassoon Marsh in Solano County, but they are rare there now. Calusa National Wildlife Refuge is probably the best place for birders to see them. And if you want to see them, it's best to look at the southwest end of the Auto Tour Loop. And remember that here you can't get out of your car, so it's good to bring a scope that you can rest on the window. They are usually not as much out in the open like sponsa are, but they will sit on the dikes and levees. However, they can be a little bit tricky to spot. And here's probably a good place for me to share how I got involved with the Tule Goose. It was actually here at Calusa. I saw a greater white-fronted goose that I thought may have been a different subspecies because I thought it had a slightly longer neck and was slightly bigger than the other subspecies. So I took a photo of it and I sent it to John asking him what subspecies it was, and turns out it was a sponsa, and I'd gotten some of the field marks wrong, and they weren't as intense as they should be on an elgasi. But that just led down a rabbit hole of learning more and more about the elgasi, and I was just so fascinated with this goose.
So behavior is all part of the equation. Think about where they're associating, and in the more heavily vegetated ponds, often loosely associated in their own groups. There may be sponsa in the area, but they ignore them. They will sit on levees where you get your best views. Literally at Calusa, that southwest end is the place to go. I don't mean to cause a traffic jam there, but we can't seem to find them elsewhere. We talked about using a window for your scope, because you can't get out, you'll flush everything. Bring a bean bag or something, or a sweater that you can set down and able to use your scope to watch them from your vehicle. They tend to be less vocal. They tend to be, again, in smaller groups. Sam Lamb felt there were differences in the way they flew and circled, and a lot of other nuances which haven't been more carefully looked at since. Lamb detailed that more than 100 years ago. This is a family group, of which you can see juvenile on the left and some adults. Next image. So this is in the Innoko River, where some of the elgasi, the non-breeders, probably involving a lot of yearlings or birds 2 years old, went on a field trip from Cook Inlet towards the Yukon Kuskokwim Delta regions. And here they mixed with sponsa for feeding and molt migration. You can pick out the elgasi. They're scattered throughout. There's one on the lower left. There's a bird top center. As you look through, you can pick out more. It doesn't help when others are stooped and others have their necks raised, but you might be able to see the color. I would consider this as evidence of rather close association of the two taxa, which brings up the issue: when is courtship and pair bonding? When does that occur? These geese mate for life. So once they pair bond, they're there throughout. Now, hunting season obviously is going to lead to instant divorces, and they will pair bond again. But as to when the young find their partners and fall in love, it's a little uncertain. The average, some studies with other subspecies indicated about 3 years, but up to 5 years. And some of the siblings, anecdotal information indicates they're still hanging around together at 8 years. So, but to consider this, much of the time, the sponsa is occurring at least loosely with elgasi. The only time that this doesn't happen is for a couple months when the adults are actually nesting. The yearlings will sometimes still hang around the adults and perhaps act in their own way as nest helpers for nest defense and or alarm to potential predators. So there's most of the references, or nearly all of them I ran across about actual pair formation were very vague, much more study needed, poorly known. And it wasn't the focus of the paper, but I got frustrated pretty quickly trying to determine that, because that's obviously very important as part of the overall systematics issue. I guess I'm leading up to, I think already the case for splitting is very strong as a full separate species, at which point I can tell you a number of birders who bird all over the state and never bothered to go look at a Tule goose, in part because it's treated as a subspecies. And obviously I would imagine probably management would alter if it was recognized as a distinct species. Next image.
So now we'll be talking about the future of the Tule goose, and here are some things to think about. The lesser white-fronted goose is the sister or subspecies, superspecies to the greater white-fronted goose, and interbreeding between the two is not infrequent in the wild. However, there are no known pairings of elgasi with sponsa and gambeli, and here's what the AOU from 1998 says under the notes for the greater white-fronted goose. The form elgasi from Delacour and Ripley differs in behavior and ecology and may represent a distinct species that breeds in the Cook Inlet of southern Alaska and winters in the Sacramento Valley of California. So that begs the question, is the Tule goose its own species? Additional work does need to be done in documenting its vocalizations, as that is very important, and further assessing its genetic differences, but it is possible. And what are its population numbers? We believe it's low, as we mentioned, perhaps only a few thousand. Its breeding and winter ranges are small, and this distinctive taxon, which, as we mentioned, is perhaps a distinct species, deserves important protection, both in protecting the habitat on the nesting grounds, maintaining the staging areas, and maintaining the wetlands in the Sacramento Valley for its wintering grounds. And as we reflect on our current situation with near record drought and increasing competition for our dwindling water resources, begs the question, will there even be water to support them on the wintering grounds or migration stopovers in North Central California and Oregon? Just the thought itself is awful and heartbreaking.
I would just add that there is a genetic study published that, not surprising, by Ely and others about 5 years ago, who indicated that elgasi and Flavirostris were the most distinct genetically. How distinct they were and the overall ramifications and decision-making involved, I'll leave to others who know more about molecular differences and what those differences are. Anyway, both of us, thank you for attending. I think we'll have time for questions and hope you will take the time next year, next winter, or actually pretty soon, right? Within a month, they'll start arriving at Calusa and take some time to look at them. Thank you. Thank you, Alex, for everything you did.
Thank you, John. And
All right, we do have a few questions in here. We have a comment from Dan Irola stating that he had a single Tule goose at Lake Almanor. Almanor, thank you, Plumas County, on 5 days between the 8th of June and 8th of July in 1984. And it appeared to be paired with a Canada goose, even though there was also a gambeli in the area. The identification was confirmed by Jim Snowden, who worked extensively with the species in the Sacramento Valley. He can't figure out how to enter this record into eBird since it's not recognized as a subspecies there. Do you have any comments on that, or any ideas about when he might be able to enter that record?
I don't follow eBird protocols closely.
Okay.
Keep in mind that now the gambeli, I assume you're referring to a taxon of white-fronted goose. That might have been sponsa. Again, they only differ by size. Turn in the pictures. Remember, you're talking Tule goose is elgasi. It's a summer record. I'm not aware of summer records, but maybe it was a bit of a stray and then got wounded and wasn't able to migrate. So whoever the reviewer is for Plumas County, you need to make a case for it, establish photos if you have it. And I'm not one of the judges in eBird.
And also, just to add on to that, also on eBird, I believe there is a section for elgasi geese. I think it's under greater white-fronted goose, parentheses, Tule, sorry.
And I think that John Harris said that in the chat that he has a suggestion or a comment that adds to that. So I'm bringing him in so that he can see what he wanted to say.
Actually, just to back up what Alex said, I think different county level reviewers set their filters differently. And so some reviewers will only put in the subspecies that are most frequently observed and they leave others out. So that might be what's happening there. It might be worthwhile for Dan to contact the reviewer directly. Thanks.
All right. We have from Benjamin Sonnenberg, are there plans for genomic comparisons? And if so, who?
Well, as I indicated, there is a genomic study, and of which Ely was involved. I can't remember the other authors, Alex, but I believe it was 2016, maybe 2017.
It was,
But
sorry,
go ahead.
It was 2017, and it was by Craig Ely, Robert Wilson, and Sandra Talbot.
And the distinctions, again, the distinct differences were with Flavirostris from Greenland and elgasi, which show the distinct morphological differences. Craig Ely has maintained a significant interest in this subject. There is some communication going on. We think it's important to get everything together for a variety of reasons. To publish on the elgasi goose, maybe the most important reason is for conservation. To put everything out, I think there's a strong case for a split now as a full species based upon everything. I mean, they're together. There's no known instances we know of hybrids, despite under the best evidence of a sortative mating, that or at least in the same area. I mean, by mating, pair bonding, which is the important feature. But it's going to take a lot of time and effort. What's needed is a motion, and really nobody has written a motion since the AOU teased us back nearly 40 years ago. Somebody's got to put it all together and make a case for the committee, the AOS and ACC now to vote on. And obviously it needs to be very carefully put together because it'll have major ramifications. I don't know how the hunters will feel about this, but nevertheless, these are steps ahead.
We have a question from Emily Strauss. Why have Tule geese declined in I don't know how to say that, Suisun marshes? Great lecture, thank you.
Too soon.
Too soon.
It took me for, I think I hope I have it right, guys. Correct me if just say so soon our talk must end, and we must put an end to questions if that helps this location. So soon. I don't know. That's an excellent question. It must be the habitat. You know, they've shifted too in the within the Sacramento Valley, where Judge Henshaw and Sam Lamb were out was in the eastern Sacramento Valley in the sort of the shadow of Sutter Buttes, and the population has shifted west to these refuges, Sacramento, Delavan, Colusa. But it must be water management practices, I'm guessing. I really don't know. There are so many people who could better answer that question than I.
All right, from Paul Lehman. One of your photos of juveniles showed more barring than on adults, opposite of other white fronts. Is that true and consistent?
Good question, Paul. We haven't gotten into that. I've not, you know, it's tough enough. When you're there on Colusa, you're trying with a scope, looking through, remember they're in the woods. And so you can't see all of them and you can't get out of the car and you're busy trying to photograph them. But that's an excellent question posed. I wonder if there's a delayed maturation cycle, and if they hang around with the adults for a couple of years, what we've identified as a juvenile, maybe it's a bird 15 months old that hasn't fully developed adult plumage. There's a lot of issues that still need to be resolved, including when they fall in love and where.
As well as as we stated in the presentation, they like to hide when they're in Colusa, so it can be tricky to see them and see all the field marks right away.
Question from Lily. Besides with climate change, are there ways we can all help them?
Well, it seems to me the number one thing is preserve the nesting grounds on the west side of Cook Inlet from um, delicately put, exploitation, or at least interference. But also, the staging areas are few, maintain the water sources, and then on the winter grounds, and that's going to run into conflict with the agri industry, competition for water, and with appears increasing droughts in the west. We're fighting for fewer and fewer resources. So that's all part of the equation, isn't it?
That's really
For
what
the
it
water.
comes down. Oh, go ahead, John.
No, just fight for the water as much as we can. It's the rarest goose in the world, really, of at least any taxa of goose. Um, some estimates are 5,000 to 10,000 birds, but as I recall, the estimates we read, Alex, of actual birds counted in the Sacramento Valley amounted to only up to 3,000, 2,500 to 3,000. And if the whole winter range is there, it's hard to think about where another 7,000 wintering. Counting them, establishing where they are, but they don't know where all breed. Maybe there's some remote areas that have not been found in South Central Alaska that have nesting birds, but it's a lot easier to census them on the winter grounds.
Yeah, and that's really what our numbers came down to after researching a bit more. And I've only seen a handful in the wintering grounds in total, just a few. And really just going back to answer Lily's question, that's really what it comes down to, just preserving the habitats where they breed, winter, and stage, because I've heard they're having water issues up at Summer Lake right now, which is one of the main staging areas for them.
Keep in mind that both of us read many papers. There's a lot published, and a lot of it in pretty remote places. So if we botched information, if some of the people really knowledgeable, we apologize. What we're trying to do is bring attention to the birding community to this subject, both from identification points of view and where they are, but also particularly to draw attention on a conservation issue, which from all indications to us is very important. But the most important thing would be to get everything published in a place that everyone could get their hands on it and know all of the information.
Diane asks, has the Tule Goose ever been documented in Nevada?
Not to my knowledge, but the one at Crowley Lake wasn't too far.
Philip Unit asks, have any skeletons of the Tule Goose been preserved? Some of the differences of proportions may be more easily quantified from a skeleton.
Excellent point. Phil, perhaps establishment by or with Kimball and Phil, or communication with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife or Cal Fish and Game. I'm sure they still have Tule geese coming through the check stations. Maybe here's an opportunity to purchase one from a hunter or get one from a hunter and to turn it into a skeleton. But it could be from Berkeley, where the other specimens are, but coordination with the museum and official outgrowth. Henshaw's letter, by the way, maybe I said this, where it details really everything you needed to know about Tule Goose in 1917, everything from Samuel Lamb. That was a letter to Joseph Cornell by the Supreme Court Justice of California, Henshaw. Kind of a neat story. And that's all detailed, the full letter in Swarth and Bryant, 1917.
And I believe it's in this paper, in papers, they also show skins of the Tule geese as well, also sometimes compared to skins of other subspecies.
Yeah, back then it was albifrons, which is what it should be again, because they're just size races, size subspecies.
Benjamin Sonnenberg asked, what's the evidence for lifelong pair bonds?
What's the evidence?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question. I looked at, there's a 2-volume by Baldessari, and there's quite a lot of, it's not the definitive thing on identification necessarily, but there's tons of life history information. And that's very strongly emphasized. Pair bonding for life, unless there's one of the mates dies. But yeah, certainly, I'm not qualified to say whether that's right or wrong, but it's strongly emphasized in their book.
Okay. And last question from Debbie House. Other than a darker color, is there any difference between elgasi and sponsa in patterning of the upper and underwing or upper tail pattern?
You know, there was something in there, but the original description that there was an average number and a number of retrices. That's not the pattern. To me, that underwing of the elgasi with the wing raised is awfully dark and blackish. So I wonder if that color carries over into the underwing coverts. Perhaps I overlooked something that was written about the darkness of the tail. I can't remember. So something to consider, Debbie, for me to think about, and Alex.
Yeah, I don't remember reading anything about the differences in the underwings or the undertail either. And as John mentioned, we've read quite a few papers, so maybe there are differences, and maybe that is something to look into.
Just one of the bill shape thing is subtle but distinct, maybe color, but the most striking difference is the head and neck. And if it's out of the water, the contrast with that white belly on elgasi, it's really dramatic, as in that shot, hopefully I have from Crowley Lake. It's much more uniformly colored in sponsa. And it's, you know how we are, we identify things, we think we really have it down, and then we go out and look at 10,000 more geese and we're confused again. So I keep going back with eagerness to look at them some more, and each time I think I found something else and then realize I haven't, or it's really, everybody needs to get involved in investigating, and particularly we need recordings. Alex is talking about going up Summer Lake, getting additional recordings and quantifying them with spectrograms as to what the exact differences are in the vocalizations. I don't know what flavirosters call, but otherwise the calls are all pretty uniform throughout the rest of the species range. I've heard them in Japan. They're the regular white-fronted geese, whether it's albifrons or sponsa, they're there by the tens of thousands in Japan. I think also, you know, we split the tundra bean goose and the Tule goose. I'm sorry, the tundra bean goose from the taiga bean goose. And there's populations we don't know which one to assign them to. So the whole thing's kind of a muddle. If you just look at the species limits within Anser and what's gone on previously with greater white-fronted goose, the case for splitting Tule goose may be as strong as splitting lesser white-fronted goose, and probably more so than the bean geese. So some sort of consistency. But of course, I'm probably biased. Others will have their own view on that.
And just to add on to that real quick, about Summer Lake, I've talked to one of the people who run the lake, and he said that the best time to go is probably around September 15th, which is what I'm possibly thinking of, because hunting has not started yet, and the Tule goose have just arrived a few days earlier. So on the lake, it's mostly, if not all, Tule geese, as they go earlier than the other subspecies.
Yeah, they arrive earlier in the fall and go earlier in the spring. A matter of a few weeks, and of course there's overlap. The sponsa breed in southwest Alaska, and the gambeli breed Alaska range and north, and then all the way over to Northwest Territory. I think we've about used our time, but I thank you all for those who are still listening, and hopefully we've inspired at least some interest in the topic. Thank you, Alex, for all of your legwork on this and collaboration.
Yeah, thank you, John, for letting me help out with this.
Well, thank you both for a very interesting presentation. As John pointed out, Alex will be speaking later with his co-presenter, Aaron Gompertz, on basics of bird photography. Our next session will be at 12:30, our first science session of the day. So we'll see you all then, and we'll have a short break until then.